We all know that Ole Miss had an elite haul in the transfer portal this past offseason. Now I'll tell you which 5 players have a chance to be all SEC caliber in this coming season. Anyway, stick around.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. Subscribe there. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. More importantly, Ole Miss every day. That's our mantra. That's what we live by, and we try to do it. Hi, I'm Stephen Willis, and this is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. And I do want to thank you for tuning in, and I hope everybody had a good weekend and into this Tuesday. So it's pretty good. I'm going to try my most ambitious show that I have ever done on the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. And we will see exactly how that goes. So, you push limits to see what can hold out. We'll see if it makes it today as well. But today we're talking about top transfer prospects that have a chance to be all SEC this season at Ole Miss. Now, in the third segment of the show, we're also going to do like a list of 5 contributors that you need to keep an eye on, but maybe they're not at the level of these guys. And there's no quarterbacks on this list. There's no Spencer Sanders. There's no Walker Howard. Those guys, we're going to talk about those a little bit later. We're talking about other players that Ole Miss have that have a chance to take a step and move into the all-SEC conversation. And we have 5 players that are on the cusp that are trying to get into that category as well. Without further ado, let's get it started off real quick. Number 1 on the list is Kaden Prescore, and he's PFF's number 3 returning tight end. Excellent player. Absolute middle of the field monster. If you look at exactly what it does, this is his zones. Look in those middle 2 boxes. You have a 149 NFL passing rating whenever he was targeted, and you have a 121.5 passer rating when he was targeted. Now, a lot of that has to do with the offense that he ran at Memphis, but you have to think that Lane Kiffin brought him in with the idea that he was going to improve the middle of the field for Jackson Dart. So we'll see exactly what happens. Now, in the spring game, we did not see much of Kaden Prescore. Now, was that Lane Kiffin and the Ole Miss offense hiding him, which is absolutely possible for a spring game? Or was the same issues that we had last season happening this season? It's interesting. It's something we should pay attention to. And I don't think it can be overstated that much. Either way, I like Kaden Prescore as a prospect because of what he can bring to the offense. And mainly, it can make it to where Michael Trigg can go out and play true wide receiver stuff, which honestly, the guy does better at this point than he does playing full tight end. Now, Michael Trigg, I think, is going to develop into a fine tight end, and he has all the athletic ability in the world. But whenever you put Kaden Prescore in the offense and allow him to be an attached or detached tight end and do all of the tight end things that they're supposed to do, that leaves Michael Trigg to go out and honestly play out in the slot and run routes and a lot of seam stuff and put pressure on the linebackers and safeties. And if you can do that, that's all going to distract defenses away from Quinshon Judkins. See, that's the fact that people don't realize. Quinshon's still in this offense. And if we can make the other parts of the offense raise their level, which Kaden Prescore will absolutely do, you might have to declare whether or not how much you want to protect yourself against Quinshon Judkins to where those linebackers are going to flow up like they did at the end of last season. Now you have somebody that can get behind them, potentially on both sides. And it's why I say this offense has a chance to be essentially the most explosive in my lifetime. And it is because of the threat of having the best running back in college football is going to put on a defense and have these talented players all around the place. He's number 3 on Pro Football Focus returning tight end grades. Really, really good player at the moment. That's Kaden Prescore, and he's our number 1 player that I think is going to really shine moving forward. Our number 2 player, Trey Harris. Now, I know a lot of people thought I would go with Zakari Franklin, and Zakari Franklin is a really, really good player. I'm not saying he's not, but Trey Harris has attributes to where if you can harness them, he has a chance to be a little bit of an elite player. The difference in Zakhari Franklin and Trey Harris, I think, is a lot of the difference between Jonathan Mingo and Malik Heath. Malik Heath is a really, really good wide receiver, but Jonathan Mingo was that special guy, and he had things that made him elite in the receiving game. And whether he was 230 pounds and he ran like a deer, all of that stuff. The other one was a good receiver. This one had elite attributes, and I think Trey Harris will have that over Zakari Franklin. He will be the guy that Lane Kiffin uses as the season goes on. You can see his stats. He played against Clemson and against Missouri. Both of those road games had 10 catches, nearly 100 yards, and a touchdown in those games. I think he played pretty well, if I remember correctly, against Clemson early in the season. So we'll see exactly how that goes, but you can see his numbers. He had a 3-touchdown game against Rice, 157 yards against MTSU, 5 for 49 against UTSA. That was actually him playing against Zakari Franklin. And UAB, which had a pretty good team, it was 6 for 63 because we all know that Bill Clark does pretty decent things with that defense. Really, really interesting stuff. And I'm pretty excited about these two. And they're both receivers, and that's probably not a coincidence with having the best running back in college football and a quarterback that is unbelievably toolsy. If he can figure out the middle of the field, which these two players will be designed to do for Jackson. Make no mistake, these two players were brought in because they knew they needed to get better in between the hash marks. And if you can press the defense there and you can get back to torturing linebackers, I think the offense will look a lot more like 2020 than it did in 2022. Although they're going to run the ball a bunch. Don't think they're not, but the offense overall is going to be pretty explosive as well. When we come back, we will continue with 3 more names that you need to watch as potential All-SEC players. Should be pretty interesting because we're going to turn to the defensive side of the ball next. Something you're probably not expecting, but you can stick around for that. But first, I do want to let you know that today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. Now, I do realize that Mississippi is a brick-and-mortar casino state to where you have to go in there to sports gamble. But if you travel to Louisiana or Tennessee, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, where we have a game at Tulane this year. Go down there, Monroe, Delta, Louisiana. If you go up to Tennessee, to Memphis, Jackson, Tennessee, Nashville, Gatlinburg, Knoxville, all of those you can use the FanDuel Sports app and take advantage of this no-sweat first bet. So don't miss out on your chance to snag that no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 when you sign up for FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, it's an official partner of Major League Baseball, and Major League Baseball trademarks are used with permission. Pretty interesting stuff indeed. Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever we get our podcast. Tomorrow night on the show, if technology doesn't get it, I'm expecting Ashanti Seastrucker. Tonight, actually, I should say, as you're watching this. We're hoping to have that is with Pratt Rogers going to join us. We're going to talk a little ball. And we're hoping at that point also as well, Andy Jaffe is up on the site as well for people to watch. That'll be last night's video. So as you can see, we're evolving a little bit at a time, and a lot of this is a whole lot of fun. Now, we talked about 2 players that have a potential to be transfers that are all SEC-type players. Now we need to go to the other side of the football. And the number 3 player that we want to talk about is Isaac Ukwu. He's an edge rusher out of James Madison, transferred in. This guy was wanted by a lot of schools. Ole Miss beat out a lot of guys. And when we talk about the war chest that we have NIL-wise, you can look at the transfer portal and what they've done over the past year as reason to kind of point out exactly what they've done. He's a really good football player. I've seen him described as a heavy motor guy. Pass rushing, he's relentless. He was a two-star player recruited out of, I think, Maryland, and he just developed at James Madison, which is what they do. They were an FCS power, and then they moved over to FBS, and if they could have won the championship, they would have won the championship. This is a really good player that's coming from a really good program. They've done a good job with the Dukes there. And if you look at his profile from Pro Football Focus, you can see he graded out really, really well. So you have that motor. You have those grades that are like that. His snap counts was mostly against passing teams, which in this age of spread offenses is not a surprise. But he has a chance to be a real impact type player on that defense, and especially that defensive front. And, you have Cedric Johnson, you have Jared Ivey, you have enough people that can keep people fresh that are stylistically different, that play that edge position, that I think Isaac Ukwu could be very effective as well. Now, don't sleep on the transfers that came in last year. Don't sleep on Cedric Johnson. Don't sleep on Jared Ivey. I just think that motor with Isaac Ukwu will be very effective, especially on third down. That's just my opinion on that one. Now, if we look at the fourth person, we're staying on the defensive side of the ball, and we're going with Monty Montgomery out of Louisville. This is somebody that people need to keep an eye on because he's a little bit of an undersized linebacker, but he's an athletic freak. If you remember the Ole Miss Louisville game from 2021, Monty Montgomery was a problem for Ole Miss's offense until he got removed from the game with a targeting penalty. If we remember that correctly, there was like 6 players that got targeting penalties that night. But Monty Montgomery was a little bit of a problem, and if you look at what he has done, Monty Montgomery stuffed the stat sheet on a good Louisville defense in 2022. That's a Brian Brown defense, by the way. And he should provide an immediate boost to the Ole Miss front seven this fall. The undersized inside linebacker had 70 tackles, 11 tackles for loss, and 6 sacks with 4 forced fumbles and 2 picks for the Cardinals last year. He's an opportunistic guy. He's always around the football. Ole Miss linebacker Monty Montgomery in store for a productive year under new defensive coordinator Pete Golding, and he made the all-transfer portal team. So it's no surprise that this is a guy that should make plays. And honestly, he's similarly built to what Troy Brown was last year. And we know he was solid for this defense, on a defense that at times underperformed a bit, but he was not the problem. He played pretty well. But Monty Montgomery takes that over this year. Now, the question becomes, by the end of the year, who's the other person with him? Like I said, we're going to talk to Ashante Seastrong tonight, but is it him? Is it Suntarian Perkins? Is it Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste? Remember, this Ole Miss team, everybody talked about the spring transfer portal and why they were worried about linebackers. You heard that over and over and over again. They didn't recruit linebackers. They recruited defensive line and secondary players, but they did not recruit linebackers, and that tells me that Pete Golding's pretty satisfied with where he is on that side of the ball right now. Good situation for Ole Miss football, honestly, at the moment at the linebacker position. All right, we're moving to number 5. Does anybody have any guess what number 5 is going to be? Because you know me, I like to mix some stuff up. But number 5 for me is going to be John Saunders. John Saunders transfer from Miami of Ohio. You saw him playing free safety in the spring game. And he has moved from cornerback where he played almost exclusively. He's like a 6'3 or 6'4 player. He's long, he's rangy, but he has ball skills. He had an interception in the spring game. He played very well in coverage versus Kentucky. If he is somewhat as physical as his size denotes, you have a chance to have a really good, really productive player, and we'll see how it goes. And this defense is going to be a lot of man-free and a little bit of two-man under Pete Golding at Ole Miss. Last year, we were predominantly a zone team. It was a lot of drop 8. You remember that phrase, drop 8, drop 8. Well, it's not going to be the case now. They're going to get up in your grill, and they're going to try and make something happen. Now, if you look at his stats over the course of the year, he didn't have many interceptions, but he played some solid corner and had 5 passes defended. Now, that Kentucky game at the beginning, he played pretty well. He locked down those young receivers for Kentucky, even though Kentucky won the game. 4 tackles in the game, 2 solos, had a pass defense. Cincinnati had 7 tackles, 5 solo, had a forced fumble, and a pass defense. So you see as the competition levels went up, he's actually done pretty well at that. So I'm impressed by that from him, and I think John Saunders has a chance to be just a good athlete on this Ole Miss defense. And you can see the ones that I said have all SEC potential from transfers is two offensive players, 3 defensive players, which tells me Pete Golding is really trying to turn the personnel over on this defense, and because of that, I think this defense has a chance to be not really good. I mean, you're not going to see Georgia or Alabama on the field, but I think this defense has a chance to be really good at certain aspects of football. They might have a really good red zone defense. They might turn the ball over quite a bit. They might have a ton of sacks. One of those categories, because the purpose of this defense and the scheme of this Ole Miss football team will be to get possessions back for this offense that has a chance to be unbelievably explosive. If you can do that, all of a sudden this football team has a chance to be really good. And we'll talk about that, honestly, when we get to W's and L's next month. But this team has a chance to be really good, and a lot of it has to do with the work that has been done by Pete Golding in the transfer portal. And I don't think that can be overstated. Now, when we come back, I'm going to give you 5 players that you need to count on to be a contributor on this team. They're going to be solid. They might not be all SEC level, but they're going to be solid, and they're going to be incredibly important for this team. So anyway, stick around. All right, thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. So give us a listen there and a subscribe. We'd appreciate it. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, we gave you 5 players that we think have a chance to be all SEC this season. Now we're going to give you 5 players that we think have a chance to win their jobs on the field and be very high-level players for this Ole Miss football team. Ole Miss did very well in the transfer portal. I don't even care about rankings or anything like that. They did very well. And as somebody that would be a prime example of that nobody is going to be talking about, we're going to start with Victor Curne. He's playing a lot of guard. He's been the one that is kind of replacing Nick Broker for the moment. It's going to change. There's different players going in there as John Garrison decides to find his guys. I think he was a 3rd-team All Pac-10 or Pac-12 player out at Washington. He's from Houston, Texas. I think it was his name, Marcel Blackwood, the running backs coach last year when he came in. Zach Evans came in. This is another player from Houston. Ulysses Bentley, the 4th, came in. That was that little circle that came to Ole Miss. Victor Curne has a chance to be pretty successful as an Ole Miss player. And just as a solid guard, he's going to be sitting next to, Jalen Williams. The other side, you got Micah Pettis. You've got continuity in 4 different places. There's only one place that you need to fill in, and you need somebody you can count on. And from all accounts so far, Victor Curne has been that guy for Ole Miss this year. Now, the second player that I think we need to pay attention to is Joshua Harris. Now, I really like Joshua Harris. He's a transfer in from NC State, an original 4-star recruit. He is a space eater on the inside. He is somebody that is going to take up blockers and make it a little bit easier for J.J. Pegues. And if all that happens, you have a chance for this defensive front to be pretty good, especially with the additions that Ole Miss made during the second transfer portal window with Akella Stone and Stephon Wynn. Those guys coming in. Josh Harris has already been here. He went through spring. He had actually a pretty good spring game. Him and Xavion Harris have kind of been holding down the middle at the moment, but I think Stephon Wynn will have something to say about that as well. But Josh Harris making people work. If they have to double team him because he's so big and such a space eater, that makes it harder for them to do J.J. Pegues. And if they do that, That makes it easier on the linebackers. So Josh Harris, as far as the health of this defense, has a really important role this season on the defensive line. And if those get taken up, obviously they can't double team an end. We talked about Isaac Ukwu in the first segment, but you also have Cedric Johnson and Jared Ivey that will absolutely get after you as well. Defensive line, they're in pretty good shape, honestly. They had a 1 deep before the spring transfer portal started. Now I think they have a pretty solid 2 deep on the defensive line. So I'm pretty fired up about that. The third player that we're going to mention is Zakari Franklin. We mentioned Trey Harris in the first segment and told you why we picked Trey Harris over Zakari Franklin. Zakari Franklin is going to be that guy this year, though. He is going to force defenders to pay attention to where he lines up. And Lane Kiffin is really good about getting creative with wide receivers historically. And Zakari Franklin is an excellent contested catcher. He's pretty good down the field, but he's really good in the middle of the field, just like Trey Harris, just like Caden Prescore. As Ole Miss needed to get better, on between the hash marks, Zakari Franklin, Trey Harris, Caden Prescore, and then make it Michael Trigg, and put him in that conversation as well. You have a chance to be pretty effective in the middle of the field. And like I said, it could be a hole in Jackson Dart's game, but I don't know exactly how it will go. Now, the fourth one I want to mention is Demari Walton, the transfer from Georgia Tech. He went through spring. He took a leadership role in that secondary. I think he's going to be really, really good. Not all SEC level good, but really, really good. And he'll be prepared between him and Jared Ivey. There's so many Georgia Tech players, by the way, that have transferred into this Ole Miss defense. I mean, Akella Stone, Jared Ivey, now Demari Walton. You have 3 people that could contribute a good bit to Ole Miss's defense. And as Georgia Tech recruited defensive players, honestly, that's not much of a surprise. But Demari Walton, he was Georgia Tech's #1 cornerback last year. His ball skills are okay, but he's really good on coverage. He's really good in passes defended, and he handles his job well. That really his last step in his development that he needs to make is to start picking off some of these passes. He just doesn't need another season to where it's 1 or 2 interceptions. Now, it's okay that the other person doesn't catch the ball, but we'd like to see you come down with it as well. Should be pretty good. Anyway, the 5th player is DeSean Gaddy, another cornerback. Now, DeAndre Prince is on this roster as well and is established on this roster. But Gaddie is somebody that'll be worth paying attention to. He's another athletic guy. The cornerback room is a lot better. I think they have a 3 deep right now of FBS players that have played cornerback. Seriously, it's like, it's people like DeSean Franklin and Justin Hodges, those guys. There's a lot that needs to be done in the fall, and Ole Miss has the ability to mix and match amongst their players to find the best players available. I'm pretty fired up about what Ole Miss football can and will become with these secondary members, and Ole Miss's recruiting absolutely lights out on the back end right now. I don't care what anybody says. I am so impressed of what they're recruiting on the defensive side of the ball for this recruiting class. Now, I'm pretty fired up. And I'm usually a pretty fired up person to begin with, but I'm pretty fired up. Those are 5 players that we think have a shot at all SEC, and 5 players that we think are going to commit or contribute to the Ole Miss team in 2023. That's 10 players out of a transfer class that was about twice that. And those other players, there's probably players that are going to pop that I did not talk about today. Just because I did not put you on the list, do not take that personally. Honestly, use it as fuel if you need to. But those are just 5 players that have gotten my attention. And then 5 players that have gotten my attention that I think can contribute. It'll be really, really interesting. Anyway, go back to Saturday's podcast. We had Walker Jones talking about the Grove Collective. Really fantastic interview. Last night, we had Andy Jaffe interviewing on the show as well. And tonight, Ashanti Seastrunk. There's a lot going on with the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. we have come a huge distance in 18 months. And I'm pretty excited, and thank you very much for that. And we're going to continue to grow. We're going to continue to find new things that we can do that's a little bit different, that can separate us, because in this crowded market, you just don't want to do the same thing the other guys are doing. You want to do something a little bit different. And that is where we are at the moment. So down below, comment on what you think about the top 5 players that have all SEC capability. Who did I miss? Who do you think will take a step from the transfer portal this weekend or this year? And who do you think will struggle to adapt to SEC football? Also, the contributors. Tell me if I got Zakari Franklin and Trey Harris flipped. Let us know. Should be quite interesting indeed. Anyway, I do want to thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. Everydayers, people that listen every day, we love you. Thank you very much for that. Tomorrow on the show, or tonight on the show, Ashanti Seastrunk. Tomorrow on the show, we will continue this stretch because we have about 2 weeks of show that will be incredibly difficult to put together. We're going to try and make it through it. Then storylines will come up for media days. And then after media days, it's gravy. It goes for like 6 months and just unbelievably easy shows. But we got 2 weeks that are hardest shows of the year. And we're going to try and think of interesting things that you can take from it there. Anyway, we'll see you tomorrow.